Therefore, we prohibit the physical or virtual disruption, shouting down, blocking, or suppressing of a protest, a demonstration, program, or an invited speaker's right to speak. Please note that disruptions of this nature may result in a removal from the event.
Good afternoon and welcome to Tulane University. It is my pleasure to introduce the next session, Energy Systems Planning and Resilience. If time allows, at the end of the session, the panel will take questions submitted by the audience. To submit a question, please scan the QR code on the screen. Please be sure to silence your cell phones, enjoy the conversation, and please give a warm welcome to our moderator, Pam Radtke.
Thank you all for being here. It's 2 o'clock on a Friday afternoon in New Orleans, and you're here to listen about energy systems, resilience and planning, and I think you're my kind of people. So, anyways, my name is Pam Radtke. I work for Tulane, but I used to be an energy reporter, starting with covering energy after Hurricane Katrina. I've covered the systems after Hurricane Ida, been to Puerto Rico for Maria. So this is resilience was kind of my beat for a really long time. So I'm really excited to be here in this panel and to have this conversation with this, I think, what is probably the largest panel of the entire conference, and we're really excited. Jason actually was just tapped, of PJM was just tapped on Monday to come, and he was happy to be here because he's a Tulane grad. So let me introduce the panel, and then we'll get started. First, we have Metin, and I'm not going to pronounce his last name, professor at the University of Dallas. Next to him, we have Tim Ong, who's the CEO at I for Innovation. Next is Lolita Jackson, Executive Director of Sustainable Cities, Sustainable Development Capital Limited. Then we have Jason Stanek, Executive Director for Government Affairs and a Tulane grad. He's with PJM. And finally, we have Lex Kumar, another Tulane grad and an associate at Hedges. I'm going to start with Jason. PJM is the largest grid operator in the country with 65 million people who rely on you to keep the lights on. What do you see as the current threats to the grid, and what are you doing to deal with those threats?
Thanks, Pam, and thanks for coming out this afternoon. This is a really important issue that I think a lot of people don't see. They may have concerns about their utility bill and how much they have to pay, but we have a serious resource adequacy problem in this country. And that means, do we have enough generation to keep the system reliable, to keep it resilient, and to power the needs of all the devices that we use to heat and cool our homes? And of course, this is even before we touch the issue of large loads like data centers. Currently, about 2/3 of the country are at risk for being short of having sufficient generating resources. That includes the PJM region. It also includes the Mid-Continent ISO region, which serves Louisiana and about 14 other states. So we're working on solutions right now, but as you know, building energy infrastructure is not quick, and it takes a tremendous amount of resources. So we operate markets. We send price signals. We recently sent a price signal that was 9 times higher than it was a year ago in order to incentivize new generation to be built. But the problem is we're not seeing large amounts of solar and wind and battery storage resources come online fast enough to satisfy and offset the retirements of traditional thermal resources. We're talking about coal and natural gas, diesel units that have run for 40, 50 years, and these units are old and beginning to retire. For those of you who saw the DOE report that came out in July, we're at risk now, according to DOE, by 2030, which is only 4.5 years away, of having an increase of blackouts and forced outages by 100%. Of course, New Orleans had a taste of that this past May when there was a power outage, but it's going to become more common. There's no question about that. Whether it's 100 times more is yet to be seen, but we're working at PJM to figure out the solutions to make sure that either doesn't happen or it's limited in nature.
Great, thank you. Metin, tell us how, I know you study infrastructure and demand growth. How are electrification and data centers changing the game, and what does that mean for system planning?
First of, I'm very happy to be here in New Orleans and participating in this forum. I'm learning new things and I'm open to exchange of ideas, starting with how did we come up into the situation of high demand coupled with low supplies. Well, part of the problem or the challenge is data centers, which would draw a lot of power from the system. That I think we know, and they are, and it has been discussed throughout this forum. And one thing that I want to highlight about the data centers is that they are concentrated demand points. So when they draw a lot of power. There are also other electrification initiatives taking place. And part of the reason behind that electrification is electric vehicles. Electric vehicles and their power requirements are different from data centers because electrical vehicles require distributed power resources. So for a data center, we know where the large amount of power will be consumed. For electric vehicles, we have to send the power to every residential location. And that translates to more distribution lines and some other problems for the grid. So part of the challenge, I think, is that the structure of the grid that we had in the past, based on centralized generation and to some extent centralized consumption, may not fit into future where we may require distributed generation and more of distributed consumption. So that's part of the challenge and the status as far as I see it.
Great, thank you. I'm going to switch gears here a little bit. Lolita, you've lived the execution challenges from New York to global projects in terms of resilience after storms, et cetera. Where do good climate and energy plans often stumble when they meet real buildings budgets and communities as well as policy and politics?
Thank you, but I want to add a couple of points to what you were just talking about data centers. My firm actually is in the data center business, and some things that we found that are statistics that you might want to walk away with is that 25% of all power in Virginia is used for data centers now. And you just have to look at where that power is coming from, how they're getting it. Also, it's significant water resources that are needed for data centers. So if you're putting data centers in the Southwest, which is already arid and dry, and they may not have capacity for a lot of water to come in, that's also an issue. So those are things to pay attention to as we see more data centers coming online. Back to your question. So my other hat, my other job, I worked in climate policy for New York City Mayor's office for quite some time. And I was the climate diplomat for New York City. So I responded to Hurricane Sandy when it happened 13 years ago and was in the middle of that. And one of the things we found is that we really wanted to make sure that the city was more resilient against future climate-related events. And one of the things that we wanted to do was make sure that buildings would actually have less emissions. So we passed a law called Local Law 97. Anyone in real estate development in this audience knows exactly what that is. 25,000 buildings that are 25,000 square feet and above, which is about 50,000 buildings, all had to retrofit to a certain lower emissions rate by this year, because it was passed in 2019, or they would get fined every year. But what happened was there were cascading consequences to that. If you're a co-op that is owned housing by firemen and teachers and people who are lower income than the high income real estate developers, they couldn't afford how much was needed for them to do that. Or hospitals really, really rallied against this, for example, and they had very high power demands. So all these entities that started coming to life because maybe they weren't brought online when the idea was coming together in a way that could have gotten them to where they need to be. Another one is no new hookups, gas hookups for buildings. So if you're a new building coming online, you were not supposed to be able to do that. And they want people to switch to electrification and induction stoves. The problem is that some of these buildings cannot handle the electrical capacity needed for these policies to actually happen. So I worked in community affairs, my very first job in the mayor's office, and I can tell you congestion pricing would have happened in 2007. Had we done that properly then, it just happened this year. So it really is important to get the community and people engaged along the way when you're making the policies.
Great, thank you. Tim, and on that note, your focus is human first adoption. how should we think about resilience not as prevention, but as recovery and business continuity when things inevitably go wrong?
Yeah. First of all, thanks to Tulane for the invite to join on this panel. So when we think about energy systems, I think we always go straight into the infrastructure, the metals, the silicon, the cement that make the infrastructure, but there's various parts in the energy system, right? So there is also the policies, the capital associated with it, but the most important bit is the community. I think Lolita touched on, the Sandy hurricane and how people rally behind it. So as we think about resiliency, we need to think about equity, right? Equity and resiliency needs to go hand in hand together. And when I talk about equity, this is around access to power. But secondly, when we think about it as well, is having affordable power. I think that's the theme that has been going on in the last couple of days, talks about how do we create affordable power in the ecosystem. So as we think about equity in a human-centric mindset, one of the things that we have to think about is how do we create the systems and how do we empower the thinking of the community to come forward. One of the challenges is, and the last senator just before lunchtime mentions that Cajun people don't like to be told what to do. And actually, no one likes to be told what to do, right? Everyone wants to co-create the solution to the challenge. And I think that's what communities need to come together. It's like, this is where, grids, utilities, oil and gas companies needs to work with the local community that they're in to come up with solutions as to how to provide power to the community, but in an equitable way. So, take Hurricane Katrina, for example. We had the infrastructure, we had the levee, I know it broke, etc., but we've built that back up. But if we think about how are we managing people evacuating and whether people are coming back to those poorer neighborhoods, they are not. Why is that happening? That drives back to equity. The second thing, as I mentioned around the co-creation, a good example is actually what has happened in Puerto Rico with Hurricane Maria and Sandy, where the engineers, the community came together to come up with solutions that actually help drive sustainability. So they trust the solutions and they continue using the solutions rather than it being used once and then they're walking away from it. So as we start going through the human-centric mindset, you can elevate yourself to a certain level. And one of the highest level that I've seen is around what happened in the Daiichi plant in Fukushima. So after the tsunami event, one of the things that you see is that the community has a concentric and a cohesion of providing the solutions immediately. So people were reducing their consumptions. Factories were actually sequencing their production cycle to make sure that there was no blackout across the whole country, the whole region. And they would manage to weather through it until the plant could be brought back online. That is really the echelon of where we need to get to when we are thinking about the human-centric nature of resiliency.
I'm going to pass this to Jason really quick before we go to Lex, because what he was saying about Fukushima and was something we were talking about a little bit earlier in terms of power steps, in terms of how much you're, like, is that something that we might move to where we're scheduling power and so we can meet all needs?
We do our best. Part of the role of the grid operator is to schedule power throughout the day, and each resource has different characteristics, right? We look at them as essential reliability services. And for example, nuclear units, you can't ramp them up and down like a gas unit. You start them up and you keep them at a level pace, whereas a natural gas unit, you could fire up, run it up when you need it at 4 o'clock at the peak of the day and run it down after people go to bed. So the versatility, the flexibility of resources and having a diverse portfolio, having units that have on-site fuel, for instance, coal, which solar doesn't have. But solar, effectively, the fuel is free. So we look at the benefits of the entire fuel stack, the resources that we have available. But the criticality today, right, maintaining resilience and reliability, is the fact that we're seeing demand increase for data centers and other reasons. At the same time, supply is decreasing. And it could be as early as next year where we see a mismatch of supply and demand, and that should concern all of us.
Right, great, thank you. Well, not thank you for that news, but thank you for speaking. Lex, tell us a little bit historically about how the U.S. Responds to blackouts versus the EU. I know that's something you studied when you were here at Tulane.
Yes, I'm a recent Tulane law grad, and I was lucky enough to be one of the early fellows of the Utilities Vegetation Management Initiative here that was started by Larry Kahn, who's in the audience. I did a historical comparative analysis of the responses to the 2003 massive blackouts. So there were two massive blackouts that basically happened back to back. In August 2003, the United States had a huge blackout. 8 states and pretty much all of Ontario went black. And then about 6 weeks later, in Europe, there was another massive blackout. So about 5 to 6 European countries went black. And what was interesting about both is that they had the same cause. Essentially, a tree branch hit a power line, and that's all it took. And it caused this massive blackout and billions of dollars in loss, lives lost, 55 million people affected across all these continents. So, but the interesting part about it is that the United States took a very comprehensive, rapid response approach to the blackout. So it was very much a top-down approach. We had FERC sort of was given a lot of authority and enforcement mechanisms. And so under FERC and various very effective structures, the United States was able to, we haven't had a massive blackout, right, since then. And there was a whole revamp of the vegetation management world. And the key to that was that there were really powerful enforcement mechanisms and enforcement authority powers that were given to these regulatory agencies. So audits and the ability to fine at a massive scale was really important. Whereas in Europe, they had a substantial problem in the sense that it was, they had this conflict between the EU power structure and the complicated relationship between the various member states and also those European nations that are not part of the EU. So when the blackout happened in Europe, it actually happened in Switzerland, which is not an EU member state. And because of that, they had a problem really reacting to the blackout. And so they essentially did nothing until 2006 when they had another massive blackout, which started in Germany. And at that point, they took a different approach. But I think what's interesting now is, the United States and Canada really, they were able to come together and create this framework that really was effective and reliable. But as Jason pointed out, it seems like we're entering a new world of new problems. And so the lessons that we learned from that time I'm sure, are useful now. But as Metin pointed out, we also have the distributive generative problem to deal with. But we can also learn about that from Europe because they have a more decentralized approach. So there are lessons to be had on both sides.
Great, thank you so much. Before we move on, I wanted a rapid round of, from each of you. Tell me what you think the biggest threat or risk is to the grid today. Metin, we'll just go down the line. I didn't prep them for this one.
Biggest risk, I think, is resilience. That's having the power when we want it, and most of the time we have it, but not always. That's a big risk.
I think the biggest risk is really maintaining the status quo. So all of us turn up, walk up to our switch, flip the switch, and expect power to come online. So I actually was in South Africa this summer, and one of the things that you learn is that that's not always the case. You flip the switch, and sometimes it doesn't come on. So as we start seeing more demand versus what we can produce, we might start seeing some of that coming into play. So how does we, as the community and the consumers, adapt to that?
I'm going to put in the human element and human casualties related to grid failure. So, as I said, I worked in New York City, and we've had to have brownouts over time. Sometimes Con Edison has to brown out neighborhoods, and people who are elderly sometimes don't want to put on the air conditioning because it costs too much money, and people may not even know that they're in that apartment. And as we all know, there have been many, many deaths related to heat. And if there's grid failures or blackouts or brownouts, we're going to see more people die from heat because of that. So I wanted to bring that element into it.
I would say it's the lack of resources to produce electricity.
Lex? Trees?
I suppose yeah, I think they've covered it all. I probably would echo Jason, it sounds like. That's the key problem. We have to
Great.
deal with.
No, I was just wondering, because like when I think of resilience, I do think of, because of Katrina and the way it shaped New Orleans, like I always think of storms and the changing climate and et cetera. So that's the one thing that's always in the forefront. So it's interesting to hear everybody else. And then currently with AI and data centers. So, but with that in mind, Metin, what do you think that some of the solutions are to these issues and these risks?
Yeah, what are we trying to solve? We want a resilient system, affordable system, and also sustainability. All these three elements actually interact with each other. We have some technology under our belt already. We have distributed generation, for example. We have microgrids. We have storage facilities. And when you look at each of these, one can make an argument that they will improve on each of the measures of resilience, affordability, and sustainability. For example, building on Lex's points of trees interfering with the transmission lines, if we have distributed generation, we will not need as much transmission lines. And once you have fewer or shorter transmission lines, there is less of a risk of something going wrong with those transmission lines. This will also improve affordability because, hey, we don't have to invest into transmission lines. They cost billions of dollars and years to develop. And on the third element of sustainability, well, I said sustainability is third. That's not my opinion. That's the consumer's general opinion. But even on sustainability, if we don't do transmission of electricity very much, we will not have any transmission losses. So that will also be helpful. So when you look at microgrids or distributed generation in general, from this perspective, you could easily argue that we have at least the technology to improve on all three fronts at once. Storage can be motivated or discussed in the same way, right? If you have storage, well, if your power generator doesn't work, you have a storage, you can pull power from a storage facility. So batteries or mechanical storage devices, they will improve resilience. Affordability is up to discussion a little bit with storage, but I should also say that batteries are becoming cheaper and efficient. So if you look at the storage, let's say 5 years ago, and consider some projects and so on and so forth, I would recommend humbly that you should look at the storage prices again, especially battery prices, and you may be surprised. And sustainability, I mean, if you have storage, actually, if you have sufficient storage facilities, we can flatten the load curves, so we don't have to invest into generation as much as we might otherwise have to do. So storage as well as distributed generation, we have this. Technically, these are all possible. This is not science fiction. Then you may say, what are we missing? Well, human element, communities, participation of stakeholders, I think is what we are missing at this stage, but I will stop there. I may go back to participation of stakeholders later on.
Great, thank you. Jason, how do microgrids and distributed generation and batteries and storage translate into the real world when you're operating the grid?
They're helpful. We've been talking about microgrids, distributed energy resources, solar storage for quite some time. and we will accept any watt on the system. In fact, we need every watt on the system as they come forward now. There's still some jurisdictional battles at the federal level, which is the wholesale regulator, FERC, and with the state level, which is the retail regulator. Usually it's a public service commission or public utility commission. But on the whole scheme of things, if you take a look at the output of a large baseload plant, whether it be nuclear, combined cycle gas, coal, it produces a lot more capacity than a solar panel, a wind turbine, or other inverter-based resource. Now, PJM as a grid operator, we are fuel neutral. We'll just take the electricity wherever it's coming from. But we've entered a new stage where the urgency of making sure supply and demand meets in real time is requiring our full-time attention to figure out the solutions on how to ensure that the lights stay on. That taking a look at sort of the DERs, which has been an issue FERC has been looking at for a number of years, is almost secondary to operating the control room on a day-to-day basis. Just on the note of resiliency, right, because that's the title of this panel, it's more complicated than I think some of us would think. You could open up Webster's dictionary and see what resilience means, right? To bend back or go back to your original position, bounce back. But FERC actually had a proceeding open for a number of years to just define resiliency, and after several years they closed it. They could not figure out, there was too many different definitions, and your federal government at work decided to close the proceeding without actually being able to answer the question. So it's incumbent on us, on you, to help define that. How do we maintain reliability? How do we maintain resilience? And I think there's a lot of overlap between the two concepts, but equally important.
Great, thank you. Lolita, I mean, with your AI work, do you see distributed generation or microgrids as an answer to AI? And then also, what was it an answer after Hurricane Sandy? Was that reviewed, or any other topics, anything else you want to talk about here?
Well, I want to now put on my non-New York City hat and the hat that I'm wearing now, which is Sustainable Development Capital. So 66% of power is actually lost between distribution and transmission. So one of the models that we have as a firm is, we call it EDGE, Efficient and Distributed Generation of Energy. So we do a lot of work. We have on-site power generation that we do for data centers, for hospitals, for all sorts of high power users. We're working with some universities right now. We're talking very extensively around doing on-site power, particularly for places like their labs that can never go down. And we have a model called London Edge that we've actually just done with the Greater London Authority, where 50 million pounds is put in by them, 50 million by us, and that's going for projects throughout London, the boroughs of London. Hopefully most of it on site, or at least being able to take some of the waste heat and use that for other things like heat networks, district heat networks, and those sorts of things. So really just taking that waste energy and using it and recycling it and using it back, and also bringing renewables into that as well. So really just trying to help the grids wherever we're working.
Great. Actually, I'm going to throw it to Lex. You've looked at the distributed generation in Europe and here. What is the difference? Why do they, I think you said that they have more distributed generation. Is it just because they have smaller country states, or?
Well, historically, so we're basically around in the early 2000s. The reason they went the more decentralized way, like I said, it was their government, the complicated interplay between the EU and the member states, and of course the non-member states. So that makes having a very centralized system difficult for them. But also at that time, they were just starting to liberalize all their electrical markets, and so there were multiple, varied local markets burgeoning at the time, and cost reduction was really their priority. And so because of that, there was really no centralized like bulk capacity provider like there was here. So they just went down that road and went decentralized, and it can be good and bad. I think they struggled with finding investment for infrastructure, which because of these new liberalized markets, they were very risky in terms of their creditworthiness. Whereas in the U.S., investment was easier to find because they're more it's more larger players, verified players, and so investment came in easier. So I think there's positives. There's definitely positives to the distributed model, but it's important to also look at the other side of it, and whether it is actually sustainable over large geographic regions, and particularly when we're talking about reliability, that's really essential.
Great, thank you. And Tim, tell us about microgrids, where they're working. I know you mentioned Arizona and how gamified system sometimes benefits utilities and customers.
Yeah. So I think before we start talking about microgrids, I think one thing that I wanted to point out is, I think going back to Jason's point, is like we have a pressing problem that we need to solve today. But I think very frequently we focus too much on what's today and don't think about the longer term and start thinking about other energy systems that we can bring into the fold, like geothermal, like SMRs, etc. And I think going back to your point about 60% of the power get lost in transmission, that's a lot of power that's lost, right? So how do we actually capitalize on that and build, SMR? So for example, Texas A&M is looking at SMR to power their university over there, which is actually a really good way of having a localized power system. So I think that's one example of a good microgrid system. But I think going back to your question earlier on microgrids, so for example, Arizona Public Systems, one of the things that we've spoken a lot around here today, the last couple of days, is around capital. Capital is expensive, both for the utility as well, which then gets distributed to the consumers. One of the things that they are looking at, very similar to what Entergy is looking at as well, is virtual power plants. So US is a very consumer-driven country, so we enjoy buying things. We buy battery storage, we buy cars, we buy solar panels, because sometimes it's a cool thing to do, right? And so what happens in Arizona, where sun is almost 24/7, 365 days a year, not 24/7, but it's a long daytime. What APS is actually trying to incentivize here is that they work closely with the local government to provide incentive schemes to the Arizona resident to then continue purchasing more of that, with the idea of leveraging those assets from consumers to then augment some of the power. They are able to generate over a few hundred megawatts of power at the same time. On the other side as well, they were also using a gamification methodology. So this is around providing incentives for the end consumer to conserve energy. And so they have a reward called the cool reward system. So at peak hours, they will reach out to their consumers to be able to control their thermostat remotely by increasing a couple of degrees, and you can opt in or opt out to it. So this goes back to co-creation with your end consumers, rather than saying, I'm going to do this to you. But no, this is an opt-in. It's like, if you want to play this game, go ahead, but we'll give you some discounts at the back end of it. And so the idea is of getting additional power when you need that peak power demand to smooth out the power demand curve during that period of time.
Great, thank you.
Could I add one point
yeah,
to this?
go ahead.
One thing that's also starting to happen is actual smart buildings and smart apartment buildings. My company actually invested in an apartment building that is a smart building in Seattle, where you can control all of the things in the apartment from your phone. So it could the shades come down at 4 p.m. because that's actually the brightest sun in the West, apparently. And the solar panels are on the side of the building and not at the top. So just everything you can control, it really saves significantly on the demands from that building for power. So something else to throw in the mix as well.
Thanks, Lolita. I wanted to ask you, because you've seen this from different perspectives. I've heard a lot over the last few days that we have the technology to do a lot of the things that we want to do, but it comes down to political will. So how do you educate stakeholders and the average person about some of these new fangled technologies like microgrids, and how do you get buy-in from everybody?
For me, it's meeting people where they are. So the people in a city who are voting for their leaders, they want to make sure their leaders care about their whole lives. And if you just lead with one portion of that and not thinking about their entire situation, you've lost them. And I always say, I grew up very poor and grew up with no parents, all sorts of things. And so I look at what my life would be like if I didn't have the education I had. And there's maybe a woman who has 3 small children, and she's trying to go to the store after work. And we said, you're going to pay $1 for a bag. and we're not going to give you a bag. We're going to outlaw bags, plastic bags, and you can't buy a bag. So I was always the person saying, well, she didn't have time to go back and get a bag. She's just trying to eat and trying to survive. So we need to really work with people and have them buy into the concepts in a way that they can actually come together with. So let's say her child has asthma. We can say to her, we want to clean up the air quality so that your child doesn't miss any more school. You can get a better job because you're not missing hours because of your sick child. And you can change their lives by bringing them along to the concepts the way they need to hear them, not the way that we want to say them. And I'm pretty passionate about this because I find that climate, we use all these words, CO2E. I was a chemical engineering major. I know what that means. But the person in the community meeting has no idea what you're talking about. So you've lost them on your slide. When you have that on the slide, you don't define it, and you just use the acronym. So I think everybody in the audience, if you take nothing away from what I said, listen to this because this really makes a big difference as to whether people want to walk alongside you with the policies or not.
What about lawmakers?
The same thing. So I'm friends with a couple of current and past mayors, and they've all told me, don't assume we know what you're talking about. That mayor of that city, I worked with Philadelphia and other cities in my past life, we assume that they understand it all. They also have to get reelected. Right? So you have to play to what they need to get reelected. If we're saying less people are going to die from heat, if you make sure that they have air conditioners, that we actually, in New York City, gave away 74,000 air conditioners about 5 years ago because we recognized that community, those folks didn't have them. So just really having people understand there's a whole ecosystem around this to keep them healthy, to keep them surviving. COVID, New York City was losing 800 people a day. A lot of that because people already had asthma before they got COVID. So all of it's connected.
Right, thank you. And Tim, you've already talked about this a little bit. Do you want to expand a little bit about how you have to bring people along on these issues?
Yeah, so I think a lot of it's going back to how, coming, very similar to what Lolita has spoken about, is really understanding what resonates with the individuals, right? The individuals in the community, the policymaker, right? So making sure that we all find a common ground that we can work towards, because we can be always polarized, working on either side of the end of the spectrum, but there is something that we can always agree on, both in politics as well as in the energy ecosystem. So I think that's really the fundamental that we want to think about, and then setting up the metrics and the success measures that direct us towards that pathway.
Great, thank you. Metin, were you the one who said that when people come to trim your trees, you tell them to trim more?
Yes, I did that.
So how do you convey that importance of something like vegetation management to the population?
Well, I have been having a lot of power outages at my home in Dallas, and it's like a couple days every year. And the last time it happened because of vegetation, because there was a little bit of wind, and then wind moved branches to touch the transmission lines, and then I lost power. So next time Encore came, I invited them into the neighborhood, showed all the trees, and I asked them to cut more than necessary. So this may go a little bit counterintuitive to what other people do. Maybe sometimes people want to keep their trees. I love trees, but I also need electricity.
But how do you tell your neighbors also why that's important? Do you tell your students? How do you explain that to them, basically?
I told this to one neighbor, that's not me.
All right, we have 12 more minutes.
To wake you all up.
Right?
Yeah. I told one neighbor, she is very influential in the neighborhood. I think that was enough. To students, I teach courses on this, and I mentioned them that they should actually cooperate with utility companies if they want electricity, right? We are more or less in the same boat here. If I don't have electricity, I am upset. If they are not selling electricity to me, I think they should also be upset to some extent. Yeah.
Lex, this is something you studied a little bit. Was that what role does community involvement play? And I think that's how do you convince somebody to do something that's ugly or just inconvenient?
Yeah, so I absolutely agree that community involvement is obviously integral to all this, but when I was comparing the two responses, what was really foundational to the American response was that the government really put in very serious enforcement mechanisms. And so while, yes, we want community buy-in, I think we can't ignore that the government plays a very important role in enforcing rules that we need, that maybe not everybody wants to partake in, but it is essential to keeping the grid safe. The other part about this is that one of the great things that they did that when vegetation management was really taking off and people were really seriously thinking about it, was that many creative approaches were integrated into the process. So, for example, when they started thinking about, what does resiliency mean, they also took an ecological approach. So a lot of vegetation management folk, they have adopted processes like pollinator highways, for example. So while they are, of course, primarily cutting trees and making sure lines are safe, they're also building these pollinator highways to take huge swaths of the land that used to be just, sterile strips where nothing grows, to have these areas become places where possibly bees and plants and birds can thrive, right? So there's many different approaches, but I do want to stress the fact that the enforceability was really key to why the American and Canadian response was so effective. And when you compare it to the European approach, which really focused on community buy-in because of the decentralized nature of their markets, it took far longer to establish that security. So I think the government really plays an important force, and we can see that from what Jason is saying.
Right, that's fascinating. Jason, I'm going to put you on the hot spot. How do you convince lawmakers? That's your job, right? Or part of your job?
Yeah, there's a lot vying for their attention right now and trying to perfect the elevator pitch, because oftentimes their attention span is a minute or two. Lots of issues going on in this world right now. But just trying to boil down the importance of reliability. I think all of us have gotten very comfortable with living in a first world nation where you turn on the light switch and the lights go on. We know that's not the case in many other countries, and we are really concerned, not 10 years into the future, but next summer, the summer after next. You take a look at our history. We've been doing this for 98 years. We hit 3 of our top 10 record days this summer, 3 out of the top 10. We hit our highest winter peak earlier this year, January 22nd. So we know demand is growing. Anybody who's using a phone or an iPad right now, you are contributing to the construction of a new data center somewhere in this country. And we need to figure out and emphasize on our lawmakers in our state capitals and in Washington, D.C., that this is an issue that needs their time and attention. And we need to move quickly, which is oftentimes hard for Congress to do.
Great, thanks. And we got through half of our questions. I'm going to see if we have any questions from the audience. There's a QR code that I didn't have anybody direct to the QR code. If you have questions, that's how you're supposed to enter them. Did anybody have any questions?
Yes,
Okay.
we do have some questions.
Okay, thank you.
The first question is, how can private sector capital partner with public sector to ensure future energy resilience?
How can public and private sectors work together to ensure resilience? Does anybody want to take that?
I can start. Well, I named one of the things that we're doing is we're partnering with the Greater London Authority, but we're continuing to speak to many locations in many cities, including one that's represented here, around how we can help them with their, making themselves more resilient and also retrofitting their buildings, whether it's, and some of them are more difficult than others. Some are very old buildings. I went to university that was founded almost 300 years ago. It's going to be difficult to retrofit some of those buildings, but, change out the light bulbs and that sort of thing, start small and work up. But there's lots of conversations happening around that, and that's actually the space that I inhabit, which is talking to cities and bringing our private capital to bear on that. So there's a lot of discussions around that. There's actually going to be sessions in Rio, not Belém, because there's no hotel rooms, those of you know what I'm talking about. But there's going to be a cities and finance session that is really going to be pretty powerful there, as well as New York Climate Week. So this is a continual conversation that is happening apace.
And I would just quickly add that right now we have a really uncertain political climate. The Green New Deal from the previous administration is being phased out relatively quickly. Developers of generating resources such as offshore wind, a lot of European firms are at risk of potentially losing billions of dollars. So matchmaking private capital with government capital right now, there's a lot of leery investors that may have been burned who are sitting on the sidelines.
He's right. So it depends on the level of government, so I should have said that. So cities are still sort of pushing ahead, but the federal government, there's more and more offshore wind coming off. We're friends with the Rhode Island commerce director, and he's almost in tears because that project's been canceled, 80% done. So you're right on that.
Wow.
And I'll be remiss to not talk about innovation and new technology and startups, right? So one of the things in the city of Houston is that we've started building a public and private coalition to build the ION district, which is already up and running, to drive new technologies around energy resiliency, but also around energy efficiency, because I think that plays a big part of the full ecosystem and the energy system as well. So this is where the Houston city provides funds and space, working with local universities like Rice Universities, but also working with companies like Woodside, like Chevron, like Shell, to actually then build that. I know similar things are happening over here in Louisiana with the fuel initiative, so I think those are really good example of where private and public capital can come together to drive the next generation of technologies and solutions.
That's great. Another question?
We have another question. Why has home vehicle to grid been so slow to scale?
I would say it's interoperability. Standards have been slow to develop. Working with the legacy auto manufacturers and the technology developers in figuring out V2G considerations has been long, and it's been painful. I used to be the chief energy regulator in the state of Maryland, and trying to have all these stakeholders in the room without much guidance from the federal government has been difficult. Take a look at an electric vehicle plug, right? We had the CHAdeMO plug. We have the NACS plug, which is the Tesla standard. CCS, it's like the VHS and Betamax wars for those of you who are old enough to remember having a VCR. So V2G is going to continue, I think, to have some struggles, particularly now with the current political environment. There's been a sort of a rollback in terms of all things EV.
Metin, you had...
Yeah, I could build on what Jason is saying. Standards, technological standards have not matured yet. So we have a lot of types of plugs and software floating around, and that makes people somewhat uneasy about how to use things and where to use them. And there are some mishaps along the way. For example, I can mention some problems with batteries and so on and so forth. I used to drive an electric car myself, and I gave up on that idea a couple months ago because the battery had problems in the car. But this is just an exception, I would say. So, I mean, all in the overall, the technology is there. Actually, I would argue that we have many different kinds of technologies which may be becoming a problem for adoption on the consumer side. So when we do these things, we should think about consumer as well as other stakeholders. One stakeholder, actually, I was thinking that you may ask about, but you didn't, is the utility company. All these things that we are talking about here, and you bring a person from, let's say, Energy, right? We are in New Orleans, and ask them their opinion about distributed generation. They may not be very happy about it. So we should have empathy with, let's say, customers as well as communities. But let us not forget about the utility companies. They are also part of the community. They offer jobs and so on and so forth. They are important for our cities and states. We should involve utility companies in this journey. They should not be scared and left on the side. So, and then there are questions of what could the challenges be for utility companies? They may actually lose some revenue when everybody starts their own generation. So then utility companies may actually get into contractual agreements to own part of the distributed generation And it's, in my mind, it's something we should look at positively and try to develop innovative ways of contracting or contracts between utilities and individuals or industrial companies so that they can generate, buy, and sell electricity to each other. That will require extension of power purchase agreements. More extensive agreements are needed there. I think there are opportunities to look at those contracts, extend them, and involve utilities. Utilities may also have some other problems. If they have distributed generation here and there, they may have problems with security as well as managing this distributed generation. But management may be okay because we have things like remote sensing, detection, remote control, and we also have artificial intelligence. So artificial intelligence can be a solution to manage distributed generation, which we need in the first place because of the demand generated by artificial intelligence.
All right, thank you, Metin, and thank you for wrapping up a lot of things that we didn't get to. We could talk about this for a long time. I appreciate all the panelists today coming from afar to talk about this, and thank you for being here again on a Friday afternoon.
Thank you all for joining the session. Our next session in this space will be Blue Carbon and the Energy Economy, Coastal Strategies for Carbon Management and Resilience. It will start in approximately 8 minutes.